For now, the FBI raid of former President Donald Trump's residence has raised more questions than answers. As FRC president and typical Washington Watch host Tony Perkins tweeted last night after hearing the news, he said, "Who trusts the FBI to pursue justice? The agency has become so politicized that even if their actions were justified, half the nation still would not trust them," end quote. Now, we've seen federal agencies used for partisan aims before, but we're also aware that no one is above the law. While we all may have a political opinion, our real goal is to find the truth. What's the truth in this situation, and how can we find it? Joining me now to have that conversation is Hans von Spakovsky. He's a senior legal fellow with the Heritage Foundation. He's also a former attorney at the Department of Justice and a former FEC commissioner as well. Hans, good to see you today.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Well, there's a lot to unpack here, but first, just give me your initial reaction. You've tracked the FBI for a long time. You kind of have an understanding of them as an agency. It goes back to J. Edgar Hoover, who we all know did not necessarily use all of his powers appropriately. So there's some history here. And what was your reaction when you saw this search raid, however you want to frame that, of President Trump's home?
I was shocked, absolutely shocked that this had happened. And the reason is that this is totally unprecedented. There has never been a search warrant issued and a search done of a former president's home in the entire history of the United States. Never. And we don't really know what this is about. And that's part of the problem here. The Justice Department has an obligation to immediately make public the search warrant, the application for the search warrant, the justice filed, and all of the affidavits that were filed by FBI agents so that we, the people and legislators, can judge whether, in fact, they were justified in this kind of a raid on a former president's home.
Hans, you say there that the FBI has an obligation. Do you mean that in a legal sense or in a transparency sense?
I think in a transparency sense. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because, as you know, we've had scandal after scandal after scandal with this Justice Department and this FBI, going back to the huge investigation they launched against candidate Trump and continued with President Trump over the whole Russia-Trump collusion hoax. And that damaged the reputation of the FBI in a way I haven't seen before. And unfortunately, that kind of damage has continued with other, what seemed like very partisan actions that both the FBI and the Justice Department have taken.
Well, Hans, we know that President Trump is a polarizing figure, and not everybody sees this as unprecedented. Here's what Nancy Pelosi had to say about the search. Let's play clip 5.
We believe in the rule of law, and that's what our country is about, and no person is above the law, not even the President of the United States, not even a former President of the United States.
Hans, anything to disagree with there?
Well, she's right that no one's above the law, but the point is the law being enforced in a partisan or an objective manner? And a good example of that here is the fact that no such FBI raid was authorized, no such FBI raid was conducted when we discovered that Hillary Clinton, while Secretary of State, had installed a computer in her office in her home in New York that contained thousands and thousands and thousands of government communications and emails, including classified materials. The FBI spoke with her. She turned out had her lawyers destroy 33,000 emails that she said were personal. The Justice Department never, ever actually got to look at them to see whether they were personal or not. And yet she was never charged. Her house was never raided.
I think you put your finger on one of the, you make a great point there, because it's the apparent inconsistency, because most of the public doesn't believe that President Trump is the first person who may have skirted the law, assuming he did. Now, I want to get into this issue with the National Archives and what may have belonged to them, but there's this concern that even if that's true, it seems to be selective enforcement, and the FBI didn't go after Hillary Clinton and grab what we know to be inappropriate storing of information. I think that has basically been acknowledged that wasn't supposed to happen, but we didn't see raids on behalf of the FBI for that information. But let's talk a bit about the merits of this, because it seems to be the argument that we're hearing is, well, he had documents that he removed from the White House. I don't even know that there's allegations that it was done intentionally or not intentionally. In some senses, it doesn't matter. The argument is those documents belong in the National Archives. They shouldn't be in your private home. We need to get those. Any sense that there were less obtrusive steps taken to try to recover those? Just a conversation, perhaps a phone call, say, President Trump, we need those. And then he just said, no, you can't have them. They're mine. Do we have any idea if there were other conversations that preceded this that may have made this necessary?
No, there's no evidence that was necessary. In fact, the Trump White House, and I think the archives has admitted that Donald Trump returned 15 boxes of documents to them in January. If there were still documents there that needed to be recovered, then why didn't Justice Department lawyers call and talk to the former president's lawyers, arrange a visit so they could go in and examine the documents and see which ones needed to be returned, and arrange it that way? At the very least, even if they couldn't get that cooperation, fine, issue a subpoena for the documents. But going into the idea of a criminal search warrant rather than simply a subpoena, which they would have to comply with, makes it look like this was a political move by Merrick Garland against an individual who may be a candidate running against his boss, which, by the way, is another reason why Merrick Garland should never have been the one to sign off on this. He should have handed this over to a special counsel to make the decision whether this was necessary.
Well, and as you describe it that way, I can't help but recall that was precisely the argument made in his first impeachment trial, claiming that the president was using his authority to interfere, to harm a potential future political candidate. And it looks like this, at least arguably, could be what is happening. But Hans, as we gather information, what information would you like to see from the FBI that would help us understand what exactly happened here?
Well, like I said, it's important that the search warrant and application, all documents with that, are turned over to the public immediately. Also, any information on prior efforts made by justice to obtain these documents. But here's the other issue. You know, there are sources saying this has to do with the president having classified materials. Well, the problem with that is that Kash Patel, a Trump political appointee who was in the White House, worked for the Director of National Intelligence, was on the National Security Council, said he was in the White House when the president declassified all of this documentation. If that is correct, then if that's the basis for the FBI applying for a search warrant, it was based, again, on false information, the very same way the applications for warrants that the FBI applied for back during the Russia-Trump investigation, when they applied for electronic eavesdropping warrants, was also based on false information that they submitted to the FISA court.
Do you think, presumably, when they executed this warrant, they had to give a copy of this to President Trump or somebody who was in the home? Presumably, President Trump has come into possession of one of these. Do you expect him to release the warrant?
Well, I would hope they would, but they may not have all of the supporting documentation that the government submitted to the judge who approved this. So, the Trump administration, the Trump office, I think, should release whatever they've got, but it's up to the Justice Department and the FBI to also release it. Just keep in mind, all of this happened only a week after a hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee. This was last week, in which Chuck Grassley confronted Chris Wray, the head of the FBI, about information he had received from FBI whistleblowers complaining about partisan decisions made in investigations involving both Donald Trump and Hunter Biden in the Washington field office of the FBI, and the double standard that they said existed there.
Is anyone looking into those complaints?
Well, Chuck Grassley did his best, along with other senators at that hearing last week. But when they tried to get Chris Wray to stay for more questioning about it, he told them that, no, he had to leave. He had to get to the airport to catch a plane. They all assumed it was for important FBI business, but we've since learned it was so he could make a vacation in New York with his family. So he obviously didn't want to answer questions about this.
Well, and perhaps for good reason, but is there there's a lot of people who are concerned about this. What do you think the congressional response to this should be? We've seen what the House right now is doing with their January 6th commission meetings that have been going on for months now. What's the way for Congress to handle this, so that the public, because I think what we all want is for the public to actually believe that the agencies, the institutions, we need an FBI that honestly does its job. It's an important role that it has been tasked with. What can be done so that the public believes that the FBI is acting in the public interest and not necessarily in a political interest?
Well, Congress needs to hold intense oversight hearings in which they investigate not only this and other cases, but in fact, bring in the whistleblowers at the FBI and get their testimony. I do not believe that Democrats like Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer in the Senate have any interest in doing that. If Republicans win in November and take over the House, they need to investigate this. The other thing that has to happen is people have to be held accountable inside the FBI and DOJ for the wrongdoing that they have engaged in. Remember, the Inspector General of the Justice Department issued a very long report about all of the errors, mistakes, omissions, and what seemed like intentional misconduct of FBI agents during the Trump-Russia collusion investigation. Has Chris Wray disciplined and terminated all of those individuals? We don't know the answer to that.
Hans, do you think this becomes a voting issue? Because it's always happening in a political environment. Everything in Washington, D.C. is fundamentally political in some sense.
Right.
We know that these midterms are happening. We can speculate about why the FBI has initiated this search at the time that they did. Are they trying to make the midterms about Trump again? The public is going to react to it. I'm one who thinks that perhaps they're making Trump look like a victim, and he's a difficult man to make look like a victim. But they might be accomplishing that in this particular case. But do you think this becomes a voting issue for the public in the midterms?
I think it potentially does if the Justice Department and the FBI do not release information justifying what they did. Because this will just be another scandal on top of what the public has already seen, everything from the Trump-Russia collusion investigation to a year ago, as you know, Merrick Garland classifying parents who were complaining about propaganda being taught to their schools when they showed up at school board meetings, being classified as domestic terrorists. And when they see that kind of misuse of federal law enforcement agencies, it scares people, and it should scare them, because that kind of politicalization of the FBI and the Justice Department is unacceptable. And frankly, it's as if you're turning us into a third-rate banana republic.
Hans, I want you to say a bit more about that point. If the public loses faith in the FBI, the Department of Justice, what does that mean for us moving forward as a country, as a culture?
Well, it's another sign of the breakdown of the rule of law in this country. And remember, that's what this country is based on. That's what has made it so different from so many other countries in the world, including the countries that my parents immigrated here from. And having a law enforcement agency that has been weaponized to go after political opponents of the regime and power in the White House and in Congress, that could have such profound effects and profound implications for American society, culture, and government. And we already have a lot of problems. This is not one we need to add on top of that.
Hans, in about 30 seconds, is there any information that you could learn that would make you look at this situation, say, yeah, that was totally appropriate?
Well, if they come up with a substantial, I would say almost overwhelming evidence of criminal violations of the law and a threat that evidence was going to be destroyed, well, then I might consider it. But so far, neither the FBI, the Justice Department, nor the January 6th committee have produced anything like that.
Hans von Spakovsky, thank you for your time. We are going to continue to track this because this is in the middle of a summer that's supposed to be boring, a very interesting story that at a minimum gives us a lot to talk about. Hans, thanks for your time today.
Sure. Thanks for having me.